A tractor pull is not a test of horsepower. That's what the dealer thinks. That's what the crowd thinks. That's what the man in the grandstand eating a corn dog thinks when he watches two tractors hooked to a sled and drag it down a dirt track. He thinks the bigger engine wins. More horsepower means more pull. More pull means more distance. More distance means the trophy and the check and the handshake from the county fair chairman. He's wrong. A tractor pull is a test of traction. Traction is grip. The ability of the drive tires to transfer engine power to the ground without spinning. A tractor with 300 horsepower and no traction is a tractor that digs 2 trenches in the dirt and goes nowhere. A tractor with 100 horsepower and perfect traction is a tractor that hooks the sled and drags it to the end of the track without breaking a sweat. The difference between 300 horsepower spinning and 100 horsepower gripping is a woman named June Nordstrom, who understood weight transfer the way a physicist understands gravity. Not as theory, but as the thing that makes everything else work. On the afternoon of August 17th, 1996, at the Hardin County Fair in Eldora, Iowa, June Nordstrom drove her 1941 Farmall H onto the tractor pull track, hooked it to the sled, and outpulled a brand new John Deere 781. Oh, that the local dealer had brought as a demonstration of modern agricultural superiority. She outpulled it by 42 feet in front of 600 people. And the dealer who'd bet $1,000 that his machine would win had to walk to June's tractor and hand her the check while the grandstand was still cheering. Stay with me, because what June did to that Farmall before the pull, and what she knew about traction that the dealer didn't, is why this story is still told in Hardin County. Let me tell you about June, because the woman on the Farmall is the reason this story isn't just about a tractor. June Nordstrom was 54 years old in 1996. She'd been farming 240 acres outside of Iowa Falls since 1972, when her husband Carl had been killed in a grain bin accident at 31 and left her alone with the farm, 2 daughters, and a line of credit that the bank wanted to close the day Carl's death certificate was filed. The bank manager, a man named Gerald Poole, had called June into his office 2 weeks after the funeral and explained that the operating loan on the Nordstrom farm was secured by Carl's signature and Carl's life insurance, and that, with Carl gone, the bank would need to restructure. "Mrs. Nordstrom, we're willing to extend the loan for 1 season, but we'll need to see the operation plan and the yield projections. And frankly, we'll need to know who's going to be running the equipment." "I am." "You're going to run the farm." "I've been running the farm. Carl drove the tractor. I managed the books, the seed purchases, the fertilizer program, the marketing plan, and the crop insurance. Carl was the labor. I was the operation. The labor is replaceable. The operation isn't." Gerald didn't know what to say to that. Neither did the neighbors. Neither did the J.D. dealer in Eldora, a man named Lyle Pratt, who told his wife that the Nordstrom woman will be selling by Christmas. June didn't sell by Christmas. She didn't sell by the next Christmas either. She farmed the 240 acres alone, driving the tractor, running the combine, hauling the grain, fixing the equipment. Carl's machinery was old. A 1966 Farmall 806 for fieldwork, and the 1941 Farmall H that Carl's father, Arvid, had bought new and that Carl had used for chores, hauling, and the county fair tractor pull every August since 1965. Carl had been a puller, not a champion, a regular. He'd entered the Hardin County Fair's antique tractor pull every year with the Farmall H, pulled respectably, and gone home with a ribbon and a sunburn. He loved the pull the way men love competitions that combine skill with noise, as an annual ritual that measured something about the man and the machine that ordinary farming couldn't. After Carl died, June didn't enter the pull. Not in 1972, not in 1973, not for 23 years. She was busy surviving, raising the girls, farming the ground, paying the note, proving to Gerald Poole and Lyle Pratt and every man in Hardin County who'd predicted her failure that a woman could run a farm alone and do it better than most of the men who had the advantage of being alive and male. She proved it. By 1980, the loan was paid. By 1985, the farm was debt-free. By 1990, June's per-acre yields were in the top 10% of Hardin County. Not because she had better equipment, she was still running the Farmall 806 and the Farmall H, but because she managed the operation with a precision that most farmers couldn't match. She soil tested every field every year. She adjusted her fertilizer rates to the test results instead of applying a flat rate like the dealers recommended. She rotated corn and soybeans on a 2-year cycle, without exception. She scouted for insects and weeds by walking the fields instead of spraying on a calendar schedule. If you're enjoying this story, consider subscribing to The Woman Farmer. We share stories like this every week. By 1996, June's farm was the most consistently profitable operation in the eastern half of Hardin County. The bank that had tried to close her loan was now using her yield records as a benchmark for evaluating other farms' loan applications. Gerald Poole had retired, and his replacement, a younger man who knew June's numbers, told his loan committee that the Nordstrom farm is the standard if a borrower can't project yields within 10% of June Nordstrom's. The loan is a risk. Lyle Pratt was still at the J.D. dealership. He'd been selling equipment in Eldora for 28 years and had been wrong about June for 24 of them. He'd told his wife she'd sell by Christmas of 1972. It was now 1996, and June had never bought a piece of equipment from Lyle's lot. Every repair, every replacement, every maintenance dollar went into the Farmalls that Carl had left behind. The 806 was now 30 years old. The H was 55. Neither had ever been inside a John Deere dealership. Lyle had long since stopped predicting June's failure, but he hadn't stopped underestimating her. And the tractor pull at the 1996 County Fair is where his underestimation became public, permanent, and worth exactly $1,000. Let me tell you about the pull, because what happened at the Hardin County Fair on August 17th, 1996, began 3 weeks earlier in June's barn with a decision that surprised everyone except the woman who made it. In late July, June told her daughter Kate that she was entering the antique tractor pull at the county fair. Kate, 30 years old, a teacher in Cedar Falls, was confused. "Mom, you've never pulled." "Your father pulled. I watched. For 7 years, I watched Carl hook that Farmall to the sled, and I watched what worked and what didn't. I watched which tractors outpulled their horsepower class and which tractors buried their tires in the dirt. I watched the weight transfers. I watched the hitch points. I watched the tire pressures. I watched for 7 years, and I learned more from watching than Carl learned from driving. You learned to pull by watching. I learned the physics of pulling by watching. The driving's easy. Put it in gear, push the throttle, steer straight. The physics is what separates the winners from the tire spinners. And I'm not a tire spinner. June spent 3 weeks preparing the Farmall H. Not the engine. The H's engine was what it was. A 4-cylinder, 24-horsepower gasoline engine that hadn't changed since International Harvester built it in 1941. You couldn't add horsepower to a Farmall H without modifications that would disqualify it from the stock antique class. The engine was fixed. The physics was not. Everything was about to come together. But June had one thing nobody else at the pull had. 23 years of watching the physics fail and knowing exactly why. What June modified was the weight distribution. This is the science of pulling that the crowd doesn't see and most drivers don't understand, and it's the reason a 24-horsepower Farmall can outpull a machine with 10 times the engine. In a tractor pull, the sled starts easy and gets heavier. A weight box on a rail moves forward as the tractor drags the sled, progressively increasing the downward force on the sled's skid plate and making the pull harder with every foot. The tractor that wins isn't the one with the most engine power. It's the one that can keep the drive tires gripping the track the longest as the sled gets heavier. Grip comes from weight on the drive axle. The more weight pushing the rear tires into the dirt, the more traction those tires have. But weight on the front axle is wasted. It pushes the front tires into the ground, but doesn't help the rear tires grip. In a pull, you want as much weight as possible on the rear axle and as little as possible on the front. That's weight transfer. When a tractor hooks to a sled and pulls, the drawbar force creates a torque that lifts the front of the tractor and pushes the rear down. This transfers weight from the front axle to the rear axle, exactly what you want. The lower you set the hitch point, the more weight transfers. The further back you position the added weights, the more the rear axle benefits. The physics are simple. The application is where the art lives. June did 4 things to the Farmall H that Carl had never done. First, she lowered the hitch point. Carl had always pulled from the standard drawbar, 18 inches above the ground. June fabricated a new hitch bracket that dropped the pull point to 12 inches, 6 inches lower, which increased the weight transfer torque by approximately 30%. She welded the bracket herself in the barn using the stick welder Carl had bought in 1968. The weld was clean. June had been welding since 1973. She'd taught herself from a library book because the Farmall 806 needed repair work every spring and she couldn't afford to pay a welder. Second, she added rear wheel weights. Carl had pulled with the standard weights, 150 pounds per side, factory installed. June added an additional 200 pounds per side using concrete-filled steel shells she'd cast herself by pouring ready mix into coffee can molds and bolting the cured cylinders to the wheel hubs. Total rear wheel weight, 700 pounds, up from 300. The added weight pressed the rear tires into the dirt with an additional 400 pounds of force. 400 pounds of grip that Carl had never had. Third, she filled the rear tires with calcium chloride solution, a liquid ballast that added approximately 500 pounds to the tires and lowered the tractor's center of gravity by adding weight below the axle center line. Calcium chloride filling was a well-known farm technique for improving traction in field work, but most pull competitors didn't use it because it added weight that slowed the tractor on the road. June wasn't driving on the road. She was driving 300 feet down a dirt track. She didn't need speed. She needed grip. Fourth, and this was the thing that nobody expected, she reduced the front tire pressure to 12 psi. Standard front tire pressure on a Farmall H was 28 pounds per square inch. At 12 pounds per square inch, the front tires were soft, nearly flat, bulging at the sidewalls, the tread sitting wide on the ground. This seemed wrong. It looked wrong, but the physics were right. Lower front tire pressure increased the rolling resistance of the front tires, which increased the torque reaction at the rear axle, which transferred additional weight to the rear tires. The soft front tires acted as a brake, a controlled drag that pushed more weight backward onto the drive tires. The combined effect of the four modifications was a Farmall H that weighed approximately 6,200 pounds, 1,800 pounds heavier than stock, with roughly 72% of that weight on the rear axle, instead of the stock 58%. The engine was unchanged, 24 horsepower, but the traction, the ability to convert those 24 horsepower into forward motion without tire spin, was dramatically improved. June had turned a stock Farmall H into a traction machine without adding a single horsepower. Let me tell you about the day of the pull, because August 17th was hot, the track was dry, and Lyle Pratt was about to make the most expensive bet of his career. The Hardin County Fair Antique Tractor Pull drew 32 entries in 1996. The stock antique class, pre-1960 tractors with no engine modifications, had 14 entries. Farmall H's, Farmall M's, John Deere A's and B's, an Oliver 70, and a pair of Alice Chalmers WD-45s. The standard field of old iron that showed up every August to hook a sled and drag it down a dirt track for bragging rights and a $50 first place check. June was the only woman. She'd registered by mail 2 weeks earlier, her entry. 1941 Farmall H, stock antique class, June Nordstrom, Iowa Falls, had been read aloud at the fair board meeting by the pull chairman, who'd paused after saying the name because he'd expected a man's name and gotten a woman's. The news spread. By the morning of the pull, everyone at the fair knew that June Nordstrom, the widow who'd farmed alone for 24 years, the woman who ran a 240-acre operation with 2 Farmalls and no employees, the farmer who'd never entered a pull in her life, was hooking her dead husband's tractor to the sled. Lyle Pratt was at the fairgrounds. He'd brought a John Deere 7810, a brand new demonstrator from the dealership, 170 horsepower, front wheel assist, the flagship of the J.D. Rowe crop lineup for the modern tractor display. The 7810 wasn't entered in the antique pull. It was there for show, for contrast, for the visual argument that Lyle made every year. Look at what's new, look at what's old, and ask yourself which one you'd rather be sitting on. But Lyle, standing beside the 7810, made a comment that traveled from the tractor display to the pull track in under 10 minutes. June Nordstrom's pulling a Farmall H, a 24-horsepower tractor from 1941. Against men who've been pulling for 20 years, that Farmall couldn't outpull the front wheel assist on my 7810 just idling in gear. Someone relayed the comment to June. June was behind the pull track, checking the tire pressures on the H, making final adjustments to the hitch point, verifying the wheel weights were seated. She listened to the relayed comment without expression. Tell Lyle I'll pull his 7810 if he wants. Stock antique class rules. One gear, no modifications to the engine, pull from the drawbar. If his 170 horsepower can beat my 24, I'll buy a tractor from him. If my 24 beats his 170, he pays me $1,000. The message went back to Lyle. The crowd around the tractor display heard it. Lyle looked at the 7810. 170 horsepower, 10,400 pounds, front wheel assist, the most powerful row crop tractor John Deere made. Then he looked down the track at the Farmall H, a machine that weighed less than a third of the 7810 and made 1/7 the horsepower. $1,000 against a Farmall H. I'll take that bet. The word spread through the fairgrounds like a grass fire. By the time the stock antique class started pulling, the grandstand was full. 600 people, maybe more, drawn by the rumor that a woman on a Farmall was going to pull against a new John Deere, and that $1,000 was on the line. That moment changed everything, and the people in those grandstands would never forget what they saw next. Let me tell you about the pull itself, because the physics that June had spent 3 weeks preparing were about to play out in 300 feet of Hardin County dirt, in front of every farmer in the eastern half of the county. The stock antique class pulled first, 14 tractors, each hooking to the sled one at a time, dragging it down the track until the increasing weight stopped them. The best pull in the class was 198 feet. A well-prepared Farmall M with wheel weights and a low hitch, driven by a farmer named Dale Rickey, who'd won the class 3 of the last 5 years. June pulled 7th. She drove the Farmall H to the sled. The machine looked different from every other tractor on the track. The rear tires were massive with the concrete wheel weights bolted to the hubs. The rear end sitting low from the calcium chloride ballast. The front tires soft and bulging. The hitch point was visibly lower than any other tractor's, 12 inches instead of 18. The Farmall H didn't look like a show tractor. It looked like a machine that had been engineered for one purpose, to grip the ground and not let go. June backed to the sled. The hookman dropped the chain on the drawbar. June set the throttle. She shifted into third gear, not second, which most pullers used, and not first, which would have given more torque but less ground speed. Third gear was June's choice, and it was deliberate. She'd calculated that third gear at full throttle gave the optimal combination of wheel speed and torque for the track conditions, dry, firm, with a thin layer of loose dirt on top of compacted clay. Too slow and the tires dig in, too fast, and they spin on the loose layer. Third gear kept the tires moving just fast enough to climb over the loose dirt and bite into the clay underneath. The flagman dropped the green flag. June pushed the throttle to full. The Farmall H surged forward. The sled moved. The weight box started forward on the rail. The pull got heavier with every foot. June held the throttle at full and the steering wheel straight. Her eyes locked on the far end of the track, the engine screaming at peak RPM, the rear tires, 1,200 pounds of iron and calcium chloride on each side, biting into the clay with a grip that no stock Farmall H had ever achieved. The tires didn't spin. That was the first thing the crowd noticed. Every other tractor in the class had spun at some point. the rear tires breaking traction, throwing dirt, the tractor slowing as the power turned into noise instead of motion. June's tires didn't spin. They rolled, slow, steady, the lugs pressing into the clay and releasing, pressing and releasing. The weight transfer, holding the rubber against the ground with a force that the engine couldn't overcome. She passed 100 feet. The sled was heavy now, the weight box halfway down the rail. Other tractors in the class had started slowing at 120 feet. June was still rolling, 130, 140, 150. The crowd was standing. The Farmall H was past the point where every other H in the history of the Hardin County pull had stopped. 170, 180, 190. She passed Dale Rickey's mark at 198. The grandstand erupted. She was past the best pull of the day with a tractor that had 24 horsepower, less than half the Farmall M that Dale had pulled with, 210, 220, 230. The sled was heavy. The engine was straining. The RPMs were dropping as the load increased, but the tires still weren't spinning. The weight transfer was holding. The low hitch point, the wheel weights, the calcium chloride, the soft front tires, all of it working together, keeping 72% of 6,200 pounds on the rear axle, pressing the lugs into the clay with a force that refused to yield. 238 feet. The Farmall H stopped, not because the tires spun, because the engine ran out of power. The RPMs dropped below the torque peak. The engine lugged, and the sled stopped moving. June had extracted every foot of distance that 24 horsepower could deliver when 100% of it reached the ground, 238 feet, 40 feet, past the previous best in the class, with the lowest horsepower tractor in the field, driven by a woman who'd never entered a pull in her life. The crowd was on its feet. The announcer was yelling something about a new class record. Dale Rickey was standing behind the grandstand with his hands in his pockets, shaking his head, the expression of a man who'd just been beaten by the physics he'd never thought about. Then it was time for the exhibition pull, June versus the 7810, the $1,000 bet. Let me tell you about the 7810 pull, because Lyle Pratt was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his dealership career. Lyle drove the 7810 to the sled himself. He was 61 years old, an experienced operator. He demonstrated tractors for a living. He knew how to drive. What he didn't know was how to pull. And the difference between driving and pulling is the difference between steering and physics. The 7810 weighed 10,400 pounds, 4,200 pounds, more than June's modified Farmall H. It made 170 horsepower, 7 times the H's 24. It had front-wheel assist, all 4 tires driving, not just the rear 2. By every measure that a dealership uses to sell tractors, weight, power, drive configuration, the 7810 should have dragged the sled to the end of the track and kept going into the parking lot. But Lyle hadn't prepared the tractor for pulling. The 7810 was a stock demonstrator. Standard tire pressure, standard hitch height, standard weight distribution, no wheel weights, no fluid fill, no lowered hitch. The tire pressure was 22 pounds per square inch rear, 30 pounds per square inch front, inflation levels designed for road transport and field work, not for maximum traction on a dirt pull track. Lyle hooked to the sled. He shifted into second gear, Too low, too much torque for the track conditions, but Lyle was thinking like a driver, not a puller. More torque means more power to the ground. He pushed the throttle. The 7810 lunged forward. The rear tires bit for the first 50 feet. The sled was light. The pull was easy. The tractor had plenty of traction. At 70 feet, the sled weight increased. At 90 feet, the rear tires broke traction. They spun. Not a little, a lot. The 170 horsepower that should have been moving the sled forward was now digging 2 trenches in the pull track, throwing rooster tails of dirt 20 feet in the air, the tractor going nowhere while the engine screamed. Lyle's problem was the opposite of June's solution. The 7810 had too much power for the traction available. The tires broke free because there wasn't enough weight on the rear axle to keep them gripping under the full force of 170 horsepower. The front wheel assist helped. The front tires pulled while the rears spun. But front tire traction on a pull track is minimal because the front axle carries less weight. The 7810 crawled forward on front tire grip alone while the rear tires churned mud. 120 feet, 140 feet. The 7810 was past the point where most stock antique tractors stopped, but it was moving on front tire drag, not rear tire drive. The rear tires were 6 inches deep in the track, the tractor squatting on its haunches, the engine at full power, and most of that power going into the atmosphere as noise and dirt. 196 feet. The 7810 stopped. The rear tires had dug themselves into soft clay below the track surface and lost all remaining traction. The front wheel assist couldn't compensate. 170 horsepower, 10,400 pounds. $98,000 worth of modern agricultural engineering, 196 feet. June's Farmall H, 24 horsepower, 6,200 pounds, $3,500 at auction, had pulled 238 feet, 42 feet further, with 1/7 the horsepower, with a tractor that was 55 years older, driven by a woman who the dealer had said would be selling by Christmas 24 years ago. The grandstand exploded. 600 people standing, cheering. The kind of noise that county fairs generate when something happens that nobody expected and everyone will remember. June's daughters were in the front row, Kate and Sarah, both crying, both laughing, both holding each other like the tractor was still pulling. Lyle Pratt climbed down from the 7810. He looked at the track, 2 deep trenches where his rear tires had dug in, the smooth track where June's tires had rolled without spinning. The visual told the story. His power went into the dirt. Her power went into the sled. He walked to June's Farmall H. June was still sitting in the seat, engine idling. The same expression she'd worn since 6 a.m. Focused, calm. The face of a woman who'd calculated the outcome before the first flag dropped and was now watching reality confirm the math. Mrs. Nordstrom. Lyle, you beat me by 42 feet. I beat your tractor by 42 feet. I didn't beat you. You weren't prepared. Your tire pressure was wrong. Your hitch point was wrong. Your gear selection was wrong. Your weight distribution was wrong. Everything about that pull was wrong except the engine, and the engine was the only thing that didn't matter. The engine didn't matter. You had 170 horsepower and you put maybe 40 of it on the ground. The rest went into spinning tires. I had 24 horsepower, and I put all 24 on the ground. 24 beats 40 when 40 is all you've got. The tractor with less power and more traction outpulls the tractor with more power and less traction every time. That's not a Farmall thing. That's a physics thing. Lyle reached into his jacket and pulled out a check. $1,000. He'd written it before the pull, before June had hooked to the sled, before the flag dropped, before 238 feet of physics had humiliated 170 horsepower of marketing. He'd written it as a gesture, expecting to tear it up. Now he was handing it to a woman sitting on a 55-year-old tractor that had just beaten his best machine in front of the entire county. "You wrote this before the pull," June said, looking at the check. "I wrote it to be a good sport. I didn't expect to sign it." "You should have expected to sign it. You brought a tractor to a traction contest. The contest isn't about tractors, it's about traction. And you've been selling tractors for 28 years without understanding the difference." Lyle didn't have a response. The 600 people in the grandstand did. They were still making noise. The kind of noise that follows an upset, a reversal, a moment when the thing everyone assumed would happen didn't happen, and the thing nobody expected did. June took the check. She folded it and put it in the front pocket of her overalls. The same overalls she wore in the field, the same overalls she'd worn since 1972, patched at the knee and faded at the hip. She didn't celebrate. She didn't wave. She shifted the Farmall into first gear, unhooked from the sled, and drove it back to the truck, loaded it on the trailer, and drove home. She had chores to do. Let me tell you about what happened after the pull, because the $1,000 was the small story. The big story was what June taught Hardin County about power, traction, and the assumptions that men make about women who farm. The pull was the talk of the fair for the rest of the week. It was the talk of the co-op for the rest of the month. It was the talk of the diner in Eldora for the rest of the year. June Nordstrom outpulled Lyle Pratt's 7810 with a Farmall H became a sentence that was repeated so often it lost its verb tense and became a permanent fixture of Hardin County's oral history. Like a weather event or a football score that everyone remembers and nobody needs to look up. 3 farmers asked June about her weight transfer modifications within a week of the pull. 2 of them were pull competitors who'd been running the same setups for years and had never considered lowering their hitch points or filling their tires with calcium chloride. June showed them, drove them to her barn, demonstrated the hitch bracket, explained the physics of weight transfer, diagrammed the torque forces on a piece of cardboard with a pencil. "The hitch point is the lever arm," June told them. "Lower the hitch point, and you increase the torque that transfers weight from the front axle to the rear. 6 inches lower means 30% more transfer. That's 30% more weight on the drive tires. That's 30% more traction. It's not a secret. It's in the engineering textbooks. The physics hasn't changed since Newton." "Where'd you learn this?" "I watched my husband pull for 7 years. I watched tractors with more power lose to tractors with less power, and I asked myself why. The answer was always the same. The tractor that won had better traction. Better traction comes from better weight distribution. Better weight distribution comes from understanding where the weight needs to be and putting it there. You learned tractor pulling from watching. I learned physics from watching tractors. The pulling was just the application." The following year, 1997, June entered the pull again. She won again, 241 feet, 3 feet further than her 1996 record, because she'd fine-tuned the front tire pressure from 12 psi to 10 psi after testing the track conditions that morning. The 3 additional feet came from 2 additional psi of rolling resistance transferred to the rear axle. Physics, measured in pounds per square inch, converted to feet of distance on a dirt track. She entered every year through 2003, 7 consecutive years. She won the stock antique class 6 of those 7 years. The one year she lost, 1999. She was beaten by Dale Rickey, who had lowered his hitch point, filled his tires with calcium chloride, and added wheel weights to his Farmall M. He'd learned the technique from June. He beat her by 4 feet using a tractor with twice her horsepower and the exact weight transfer method she'd shown him in her barn. "Dale beat me with my own physics," June told Kate that evening. "That's not losing. That's teaching." Lyle Pratt retired from the J.D. dealership in 2001. His retirement party was at the fairgrounds, the same fairgrounds where he'd lost $1,000 to a Farmall H 5 years earlier. June was invited. She came, not to gloat, not to remind, but because Lyle had, in his own way, earned her respect. He'd made the bet. He'd paid the bet. He'd walked to her tractor in front of 600 people and handed her the check without excuse or delay. That was more than most men would do, and June recognized it. At the retirement party, Lyle told one story. He told the pull story. He told it the way it happened. The bet. The preparation he didn't do. The physics he didn't understand. The 42 feet that a woman with a 1941 Farmall had put between his best machine and the end of the track. "I sold tractors for 33 years, Lyle told the crowd. "I sold horsepower. I sold bigger engines and wider tires and more hydraulic pressure. And June Nordstrom taught me in 238 feet that none of it matters if the power doesn't reach the ground. She put 24 horsepower on the ground, and I put 40 out of 170. She won because she understood something I never sold, that the ground is where the work happens, and the machine only matters if the ground agrees." June was standing in the back. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The story spoke. The $1,000 check, which she'd never cashed, framed instead and hung in the barn beside a photograph of Carl on the Farmall H in 1970, spoke. And the Farmall H, sitting in her barn, wheel weights bolted, calcium chloride still in the tires, hitch bracket still at 12 inches, spoke loudest of all. "Let me tell you how this ends. June Nordstrom retired from active farming in 2008 at 66. Her daughter Kate's husband, Brian, took over the 240 acres. June still lives on the farm. She still walks the fields every morning in growing season. She still reads the soil tests before Brian does. And she still enters the Hardin County Fair antique tractor pull every August. Her record stands 6 wins in 7 years, 1996 to 2003. The Farmall H holds the all-time distance record for the stock antique class at the Hardin County Fair, 244 feet, set in 2001. Nobody has beaten it. Several have tried using June's published weight transfer method. She wrote it up as a 2-page handout and distributed it at the fair in 2000 because she wanted the competition to improve. The competition improved. Nobody reached 244. The Farmall H is in the barn. 55-year-old iron in 1996. 83 years old now. The wheel weights are still bolted. The calcium chloride is still in the tires. The hitch bracket is still at 12 inches. The seat still holds the shape of the woman who drove it, not Carl's shape anymore, though his ghost rides there too. June's shape. The shape of a farmer who watched physics for 7 years and then applied it in 238 feet, that rewrote the record book and the county's assumptions about what a woman on an old tractor could do. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to The Woman Farmer for more. We'll see you in the next one. The dealer bet on horsepower. She bet on weight transfer. The chain went tight, and the whole county learned the same lesson. 170 horsepower, spinning. 24 horsepower, gripping. Because pulling isn't about the engine. Pulling is about the ground. And the woman who understood the ground outpulled the man who only understood the machine. $1,000, 42 feet, one Farmall H. One woman who watched for 7 years and knew exactly what she was doing when she finally drove.